In 1992, the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina declared its independence from Yugoslavia. Civil war erupted between Bosnian Serbs, who wanted to remain part of Yugoslavia, and the Republic's Croats and Muslims. Serb separatists mounted an armed siege of Sarajevo, Bosnia's capital and largest city. By the time the war ended in late 1995, more than 10,000 Sarajevo residents had been killed and thousands more had been wounded.
On May 21, 1990, members of the activist group ACT UP, or AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, demonstrated in front of the National Institutes of Health headquarters in Bethesda, Maryland. They demanded that government officials and research scientists develop better treatments for people with AIDS and a greater representation of women and minorities in clinical trials. Since it was formed in the mid-1980s, ACT UP has used provocative demonstrations to criticize government funding and research efforts, as well as to increase public awareness about AIDS.
Before a sumo wrestling match begins, the competitors practice a series of rituals such as stomping and glaring. When competing, the wrestlers, called sumotori, try to push each other out of the ring or onto the floor. Pushing, pulling, slapping, throwing, and grappling are all permitted. Flexibility and speed are important, but weight is often the deciding factor. Benito Mussolini, the founder of Italian fascism, seized power in 1922. Known as Il Duce, the leader, Mussolini assumed control over all aspects of Italian life. Backed by a black-shirted militia, the charismatic Mussolini quickly won support for his nationalistic policies. Repeated Italian defeats during World War II, however, led to domestic unrest, and in 1943, Mussolini was ousted from power. In late 1989, citizens of Czechoslovakia staged pro-democracy demonstrations against the communist-led government. Despite initial police resistance, rallies in the capital city of Prague attracted more than 200,000 people by November. Unable to curb the demands for political change, the communist government collapsed in December. Alexander Dubček, who had led a movement for reform in 1968, was elected chairman of the Federal Assembly, while playwright and opposition leader Václav Havel was chosen as the country's new president. Because of its bloodless nature, the transition to non-communist rule in Czechoslovakia became known as the Velvet Revolution. In the mid-1980s, South Africa entered an increasingly bloody chapter in the struggle to end apartheid, the country's rigid policy of racial segregation. In 1985, in the black township of Soweto, police arrested hundreds of students, some as young as 7 years old, who were participating in a school boycott. Faced with an escalating crisis, the South African government declared a nationwide state of emergency. Thousands of blacks were detained and thousands more killed before apartheid was dismantled in the early 1990s. On January 1, 1994, a group of Native Americans led a rebellion in Mexico's southern state of Chiapas. Calling themselves Zapatistas, the group demanded better economic conditions for rural farmers and improved treatment for indigenous people. The rebels seized several towns but retreated into the forest after Mexican troops arrived. A tense standoff ensued and attempts to negotiate a settlement failed. The Spanish Civil War began in 1936 when military generals staged a coup against the democratically elected government of Spain. The coup failed, but it left Spain divided between right-wing nationalists who supported the generals and a coalition of left-wing parties who backed the Republican government. Fierce fighting between the Republicans and nationalists continued until 1939, when the nationalists finally occupied the capital city of Madrid. In the end, casualties mounted to 500,000. Between 250 and 500,000 fled the country, and General Francisco Franco, the nationalists' leader, became dictator of Spain.
Letters of thanks, letters from banks, letters of joy from the girl and the boy, receipted bills and invitations to inspect new stock or visit relations and applications for situations and timid lovers' declarations and gossip from all the nations.
In 1945, the victors of World War II, Western democracies and the Soviet Union, divided Europe between them. Struggles against communist rebels in Greece and the siege of the Western enclave in Berlin signalled a new European conflict, the Cold War. The Maoist victory in China and the outbreak of the Korean War took the struggle beyond Europe, while McCarthyism in the United States demonstrated that it was affecting public opinion even in the world's great democracies.
Are you a member of the Communist Party, or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
In 1961, the Berlin Wall went up, dividing Berlin, while in 1962, a US-Soviet standoff over missiles in Cuba brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. In Vietnam, a war between communists and Western-backed forces was to demonstrate the limits to US military might. Meanwhile, in 1968, Czechoslovakia rose against rigid communism, only to be crushed. In 1975, the Vietnam War ended in defeat for anti-communist forces. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan brought a new harder line in US-Soviet relations, and Mikhail Gorbachev tried to reform communism with his glasnost policies.
We want friendship between our two people.
But once reform had begun, pressure for change proved unstoppable, and the Iron Curtain crumbled before the people it had once divided.
Curling is a winter sport played on ice. Curlers slide a heavy granite stone down the ice, attempting to land it inside a target area called the house. By sweeping in front of the stone with brooms or brushes, players warm the ice slightly. This causes the stone to slide straighter and farther. On April 18, 1906, the city of San Francisco, California was rocked by an earthquake estimated at 7.7 to 7.9 on the Richter scale. The earthquake started a fire that lasted for 3 days, destroying much of the city's downtown. Thousands of people were left homeless. Many buildings left standing were so damaged that they had to be torn down. In the wake of the disaster, refugee camps sprang up throughout San Francisco. Families who had lost most or all of their possessions were forced to live in tents in often squalid conditions. Looting was a serious problem, and food was carefully rationed. Overall, the Great San Francisco earthquake and its aftermath destroyed over 28,000 buildings and claimed over 3,000 lives.